Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really glad to be back talking with you all again, or rather you listening, me talking, and to be back with a very dear friend and courageous, esteemed colleague, Fiorella Isabel, who's based in Moscow. Welcome, Fi.
Thanks for having me. Nice to hear from you.
I really wanted to talk to you, particularly with your experience of living and working in Russia, about the events since the Turkish, or rather the Ottoman Nazi Zionist Wahhabi Ikhwan coup that was carried out in Syria, which was an extension of the coup that began back in 2011 and failed and then was finally successful for a number of reasons on the 8th of December 2024. I had to think about that. And basically what has been happening since then, we've definitely seen a regional, in Turkey, definitely, in my opinion, alongside Israel, coming to the top of the heap as regards control of Syrian territory and control of the proxies on the ground, slightly sidelining the United States and its Kurdish separatists and ISIS, and although I would still include Al Qaeda as assets of the United States cartel also. But it's culminated in some interesting events in the last, let's say, 10 days, one of which was basically the terrorist Junta government. It's not elected. It's a transitional government. It has not gone through any election process to arrive at President Jolani, and I refuse to use his adopted name of Al Sharaa. The military in Syria now consists of probably around 30 to 40% of foreign mercenaries, so it's no longer a national army, in my opinion. And yesterday, Jolani was declared president without any election. And knowing that he has admitted that he has less than 10% popularity in Syria, so therefore he's delayed elections for another 4 years. And we've seen the closure, basically, or rather the refusal by the transitional government to continue the contract with Russia to keep its military bases on the Syrian coastal areas in Tartus and Latakia. And we've seen in recent days a visit by Bogdanov, the deputy foreign minister, to meet with Jolani in Damascus. And some fairly surprising details came out of that meeting, some of which have not yet been confirmed, to my knowledge, by Russian statements. One of which included reparations for damage done to Syria during the Assad presidency, so that one assumes refers to Russian intervention also at the invitation of Assad from 2015 onwards. But also more interesting for me, I think, is this potential for a request for Russia to extradite President Assad, who was given humanitarian asylum by Russia when he was forced to flee Damascus on the 8th of December. I think I've got that date right. So I guess I'd just like to get your opinion on the implications of those meetings that have recently been held in Damascus, both for Russia and I guess long term for Syria.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of implications in
Yeah,
in that. I mean, it is a hefty situation, and the whole Syria fall. Why did Syria fall? I don't think is 100% answered yet. A lot of people have chosen to take an answer and pin it only on Syria and
yeah,
the Syrian army, and saying that the army only abandoned, and all of this, but there's so much more at play. And I think a lot of the events happening now, like this meeting between NATO and Israel's chosen puppet Jolani with the Russian deputy foreign minister in Damascus, really says so much, because obviously what is going to be put out in media is they met to discuss these bilateral and political issues and talk about, strengthening their ties and all of that. But the reality is Russia has been fighting specifically against these very factions, and that is the gigantic elephant in the room that nobody seems to be talking about really in an in-depth way when we hear all of these scenarios, when you hear specifically everything that has been laid out. They're talking about Russian participation in Syria's reconstruction. They're talking about the economic possibilities and the possibilities in infrastructure and transportation, but they're not relaying what exactly happened or to get there. The fact that Russia fought alongside with Syria for years, for over, essentially nearly a decade, and you have all of this completely be pushed aside in the favor of the presenting diplomatic aspects of this. And that's what, not surprising if you understand how the Russian government works. They're very much pro-diplomacy. I think we've talked about this, or at least I've mentioned it. When it comes to Russia and China, they very much lead with, oh, we need to follow the UN chapter. We need to follow these protocols. This is how we present our foreign policy. Very much different than the West that comes in, like Donald Trump has come in, making demands out of countries, just saying, if you don't do this, and we're gonna, increase tariffs, or we're gonna do this or that, and coming in with threats. It's very different. However, there is a little bit of impatience that I get sometimes with Russia, because there was absolutely no need to be so rapid and so quick and just going after this meeting with a terrorist that has, as you mentioned earlier, become president without a single election, without being voted in by anybody as part of a transitional government. But Russia has been one of the first. In fact, actually, it was the Belarusian prime minister
Yeah.
that actually went to Damascus as well, and went before. So that also signaled something, because why is Eurasia, right, so quick to recognize this sham of a government? Like, what exactly benefits them at this moment? And what we do know is Russia, obviously, as you mentioned, has the military bases, but we know also that these bases are no longer necessarily essential to them. They're essential in terms of Russia keeping their foot in the door in Syria. But is it a necessity? Because one of the arguments was, well, Russia didn't need Syria anymore, so therefore, things changed, and this is why Russia was willing to compromise with Turkey. But the reality is that Russia does not really want to abandon their bases. And this kind of gives us insight into that, into the conversation, not just between Lavrov prior, who met with the the Qatari prime minister, where they talked about, Syria and how they want to unite and create something for all Syrians. This indicates to me this era of normalization that we have been discussing, this era where you see an effort of diplomacy, but the diplomacy is, to me, very vapid and very vulnerable, because it is not a diplomacy based on the reality of what is, the reality that Jelani is a terrorist, part of a government that shouldn't be there, that pushed a coup. And if Russia has always been against forceful violence of this sort. So to me, it indicates so much that they are willing to just have these conversations so quickly. Instead, what we get from the West, from NATO, they simply don't recognize a government that they don't feel is quote unquote democratic. On this end, though, we're getting that recognition so quickly. So to me, this signals an attempt to normalize relations with Syria, to try to maintain their base, try to maintain some sort of presence there. But it also signals the fact that they understand they're vulnerable to Turkey, to Erdogan, and to the entire NATO collective because of the Black Sea grain corridor. This is a strong vulnerability that I think has been weaponized by Turkey against Russia, and also to a greater extent, of course, NATO. They know that Russia needs to have a relationship with Turkey, and that Turkey has the upper hand because of this specific corridor. So I think there's a lot to be said on that as well.
Yeah, and I think if we're talking, I mean, two things there that you mentioned that I think are really important. One is this sudden pivot to Qatar, when we bear in mind that one of the reasons that Syria was targeted by the regime change war operation was because it rejected the Qatari-Turkish pipeline in favor of the Iranian-Russian pipeline. So effectively, we can say one of the reasons that Syria has been warred against since 1946 is because of its relationship with first of all, the Soviet Union and then with Russia. And so I'd like to get your opinion on that. But also, you mentioned Turkey and the Russian dependence on Turkey. And of course, that also applies to Russia's pivot from Syria, in theory, moving the bulk of its military footprint from Syria to Libya. And how there also it appears that Turkey is very much in control, because Turkey controls much of Libyan territory and it has done for some time. Interesting, also using the same kind of HTS affiliated elements to do so, that Russia is now apparently normalizing within Syria, having been fighting against them for X number of years, right? And of course, Russia needs the Libyan base, one assumes, in order to continue its operations in Africa and also in other areas of Africa. It's sort of equally dependent upon Turkey. So those two things, first of all, are we really seeing Russia? You know, much of the criticism has been about Assad pivoting from the resistance axis towards the Gulf states, for example. But are we seeing Russia do exactly the same thing? And does that mean to some extent, was Russia, now I'm thinking out loud, was Russia perhaps involved in Assad's pivot towards the Gulf states? That's just something that popped into my head. So I don't expect you to kind of follow my thought pattern.
You know, it's very interesting, and one of the ways I want to begin talking about that is Russia is extremely pragmatic. Vladimir Putin is a very pragmatic person. However, he was shaped by being a part of the Soviet Union, right? And you have that understanding of what it was, but you know, when he was a part of it, there was so much betrayal coming in from the West via, you know, certain political figures. And with that, people had this idea that Russia coming out of the Soviet Union was essentially an extension of it. And in some ways it was. In some ways it has kept its structure in terms of government structure, in terms of centralization of you know, medicine, education, that sort of thing, bureaucratic things. But in terms of its economy, it's a very capitalist driven economy. It's an economy of expansion, of understanding and using its natural resources. And it is one that has recognized that it is at odds with the collective West. However, mistakenly, what I see here and my experience in being here is that many still don't understand the US American way of conducting politics, of really foreign policy, and the thought process of where they come from is not the same. It's not just that Russia's coming in diplomatically, is that they're coming in to have a equitable, cooperative relationship that is beneficial to both. Whereas the United States, especially with somebody like Donald Trump, is coming in to have a very not just unilateral, but almost tyrannical type of relationship. If you don't do as we say, then you will be faced with consequences. That hasn't changed from the Biden administration. And I know that, Lavrov has made hints about that, and Putin has made hints about that. But from what I'm seeing with this relationship, with the attempts to have this relationship with the new quote unquote free Syria with Turkey and meet with the Gulf states. What I'm seeing here is an effort to maintain this diplomatic semblance in spite of the fact that they know better and in spite of the fact that these are very close allies, or I would say almost subjugations of the United States. The United States and NATO control all of these states. Therefore, it's almost like you are trying to build some sort of diplomacy with these manipulated factions, and that's not going to get you anywhere. And the way I see that is because they lack the understanding that there is no negotiating with the United States from this level. You can negotiate if you have, and once you have the power. But right now you have Russia still facing the war in Ukraine with talk of this potential deal that's supposed to happen this year. Both Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko and has said that, and it has also been put out by the Trump administration, though it has been denied by the Russian government that there have been specific talks related to this, but we don't really know what's going on behind the scenes. And as you mentioned earlier, this conversation, right? Everything that happened before the fall of Syria, we can go back to the Doha meeting that became infamous. This meeting where there was obviously deals made, but the extent as to which Assad was in on those deals is I think it can be argued still. And also the Gulf state pivot. Did Assad do that under the advisory of others he trusted? Because that could definitely, and I'm also thinking out loud, that definitely could be something that I think could happen. We tend to take advice from those we trust around us. And when you get to a point in government where you have you're a president and you have people that you've delegated and confided in. And sometimes a lot of these presidents, from my experience that I've seen in several governments, may be very intelligent, wise, and smart, whatever, but they have their limitations of time and abilities to deal with it all, and they confide in the wrong people. And then what ends up happening is you have different factions that control different things, and there is a lack of communication there. And I do think that when we talk about Russia, there are different factions in the Russian government. You have the presidency and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You have the Defense Department in Russia, and you have the State Duma. And not all of these are in agreement. And people need to understand that just like the United States, Russia has different factions that want different things, and not the president may not always be clued in to every single thing that's happening. And so when you see these attempts and these comments, like from the Belarusian president Alexander Lukashenko, on how Trump is doing the right thing and how he should be given a Nobel Prize, he said this. If he manages to settle a peace deal in Ukraine, you see that they still don't understand that Donald Trump was put in this position of power to be that guy, to hand down the gauntlet and say, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to end this. If Russia were to take this deal, and I think this has a lot to do with the Syrian question, then it points to perhaps that this was planned prior, that because Donald Trump didn't just come up with this himself, he's just got into office. All of these things do not happen out of nowhere just when he comes in. All of this has been planned. They need to understand that all of this has been coming as a plan for whoever was going to be the president to do this, whether it was Trump or Biden. Trump was clearly selected to do this, and now he's going to take the reward of being the one who will initiate the ceasefire, it seems. And if Russia accepts something of this negotiation where it has to give something, where it has to make some sort of concession, it is a loss for Russia, because right now Russia doesn't need to make concessions. Russia is winning on the battlefield. And this is, I'm not, being a Russian propagandist. I am telling you, strategically and tactically, and in terms of weapons, in terms of ammunition and soldiers and land that they have acquired, Russia has already won this war. The problem is that the United States and NATO fail to recognize this, of course, along with Ukraine. And so therefore they're just extending it as if it's still ongoing. So if Russia were to come in and say, look, we're going to have a conversation, that's fine. But if they actually give in and subject to perhaps NATO troops coming in, in a few years and something, they will be eventually laying out the can down the road. They would be kicking the problems down the road, because we know that the theaters are already shifting towards Iran. We know that the theaters are focused also on China and Latin America, as we can see clearly. But that doesn't mean that this will benefit Russia in the long run. And that's how I've also felt about the ceasefire, and how I feel in general about this administration. It is like a Trojan horse, a set of Trojan horses coming in to act like they're ending, things, but really it's just the start of a different direction.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. And I think now it's important also to look at it, from a Brzezinski lens to a degree, the grand chessboard, and look at Eurasia as a whole now being the target. And for me, it appears as if there's a huge race going on, between the Neo-Ottomans, who are appearing to expand their territory control as far as the borders with Western China, which of course is very dangerous because of the number of Uyghurs that are operating inside Syria right now under the HTS banner. The US, UK, Israel, which of course itself is pushing to take control, particularly of high ground, but also of water resources. That's another thing that needs to be sort of factored into analysis in the future, because water is going to become a far more important resource than hydrocarbons in the future. And I think, and the other thing, of course, that is surely going to be problematic for any Russian HTS relations, which they do seem to be pushing for, obviously under the auspices of Turkish protection, I assume, which is still a NATO member state, is that the US and the UK will then use sanctions as a weapon to prevent Russian influence remaining in Syria. So they're already saying to HTS, well, okay, but if Russia remains in Syria, then we're not going to lift the sanctions. So it just, for me, it just feels that, there are a lot of people, not a lot of people, but there are people saying that this is all some kind of 5D chess game that Russia is playing. I'm struggling both with my knowledge of what happened on the battlefield during the 10 days that it took to topple a country as vast and complex as Syria. And then what has happened since. I don't see the advantages to Russia of what's happened in any way, shape or form. And going forward, if we look at the new strategic partnership with Iran, for example, and I'll just take one aspect of that. Well, two. First of all is the north-south corridor, which is going to pass through Baku and then in Azerbaijan and then end up in Mumbai. Well, I'd like to get your opinion on that, because for me, I see immediate issues, because Baku is basically under the control of Israel, because Russia really relinquished its control over Armenia some time ago, which again I think was potentially a mistake, because it's now left Turkey in control again in that region, and of course then you've got the Baku, Georgia, Turkey by rail network that has been supplying oil to Israel throughout the genocide in Palestine. And of course, I'm sure it's no coincidence that Georgia has also been subjected to attempts at color revolution and so on. And then, of course, coming into Mumbai. Well, I know Mumbai is an area of something like 5 million people, as someone here pointed out to me. But nevertheless, it's the beginning of the India Middle East Economic Corridor, which is on Netanyahu's map the blessings compared to the curse, which is West Asia and Iran. So I would really like to get your take on that, because are they putting themselves in another bind by getting so now heavily involved with Iran, and by the potential confrontations or challenges within that north-south network corridor itself?
Yeah, I mean, at face value, it doesn't seem like anything out of the ordinary for Russia to have this comprehensive strategic partnership with Iran, because they have for a long time been cooperating. However, in the context of the background of everything else that's happening, there's so much at things that could be at play here, because of the fact that Pezeshkian is not necessarily the strongest leader that Iran has had, to say the least, in terms of his also willingness to break bread with the West. And at multiple times. Obviously, he's not the one in charge, but we have also heard that the supreme leader is also ready to have conversations with the United States. And I'm not against conversations. I mean, this isn't like in an ideal world, we would have world peace and there would be no war. But we're not talking about an ideal world. We're talking about this one. And this one is a world where we have a very, very angry and scared U.S. State Department and Pentagon that know they are in decline. They know that. And just like Rome, and I have to make this comparison because it is so valid. Just like Rome, they will take down so much as they go down. And that's what I think we're seeing here in a greater context. And the relationship between Russia and Iran, as you rightly put it, puts them in another position to be vulnerable to the continued attacks about this relationship, because the United States always says, oh, if it was, for example, Palestinian protesters are somehow connected to Iran. If it's something going on in the U.S. where there's some sort of hacking, oh, they're connected to Russia. And with this type of partnership, they're obviously gonna use it against them. But that's neither here or there, because that's been an ongoing development. What I think is important about this is that it is going on in the context of the potential, I would say, era of normalization that we're seeing. And to me, based on Iran's latest statements, it does seem like they're also on that agenda. And I don't know if you would agree with that, but in terms of what I've seen Iran say in terms of having conversations with Donald Trump and Donald Trump's attempts to want to broker peace with Russia, I don't see this as much of a deterrence if that is true. So what I mean is, if, for example, there is a deal that has been made between Iran, Russia, and Turkey, as you say, this is now Turkey having the upper hand in the region. I see this as just part of the next phase of the world. And you're right, like when you talk about this area of Eurasia and looking at it from that point of view, I think what we're seeing is not just this competition, but I think it's going to be an all out war eventually, that there is an attempt right now to pull away from that, right? So I think it's inevitable, this confrontation between the China contingent and the West. It is obvious. We've been seeing on the news the conversations about DeepSeek, this new AI software that's similar to ChatGPT, that's like really being talked about heavily. We've seen the TikTok scenario that's completely derived the whole question as to what is the US hiding about China, and we've seen people start going to these Chinese social media sites, and we're seeing that face to face reality come up. But what we're also seeing is these superpowers like Iran, like China, like Russia, always back away from any sort of real, like, strong stance. I'm not pushing for a global war, but what I'm looking at is there is no unity between the non-aligned axis. They are acting, in my opinion, from what I'm seeing, in spite of the diplomatic fronts, in spite of all of these treaties, in spite of all of that, they are acting in terms of their own political interests, which aren't necessarily a bad thing. But when you're facing the NATO collective that is acting as a unit and that is going to stick as a unit, and you are acting in different directions, that obviously leads to the potential for a vacuum of power diversion, and by that I mean essentially for sabotage, for deals that are made behind the scenes. And it also leads to the vulnerability of other countries that don't have the capacity to face the West, the United States, in the same way that Iran, Russia, or China do. And I do see that China and Russia in particular stay away from these conflicts that are not necessarily involving them. And a lot of people don't see anything wrong with that. But again, it's not like there's something wrong with that, but it's more along the lines of, if there is no cohesion in these interests that are not going to come together and then oppose the collective West, then it's not going to happen. And I think people are under the impression, because of BRICS and multipolarity, that this is a thing that's happened, but it hasn't. It's only been talked about. It's happening in terms of other countries pushing back, but there's no actual connectivity. There's no actual I guess, block that actually serves as a counter to NATO. BRICS is serving as an economic power that obviously has the potential to be something that can oppose the G7. Obviously, it's already there in those terms, but in terms of actually being a collective thing, they're actually pushing away from that. They're actually going back to the UN. They're actually saying, oh, well, we're not going to create this new coin yet. And we're going to allow, anybody, not anybody, but like Saudi Arabia to come in, Turkey to come in, it's going to be, it's not opposing anything. And for me, this puts the whole thing in a vulnerable position that I just see it going in a very negative direction for the non-aligned axis, particularly Russia, particularly Iran. I see this era acting as a positive, but really pushing things down the road when we talk about polarizing Iran, right? Because the relationship between Turkey and Russia is is also a relationship to polarize Iran, in spite of this relationship that in the front you're watching Russia show with Iran. I do think that they're still polarized because now they have to have this stronger relationship with Ankara, and that's just the reality of that.
Yeah, and also bringing in Qatar and Saudi Arabia, of course, because I think
Yes.
it was fairly recently it was published that Russia has been supplying pretty large amounts of weapons and armaments to Saudi Arabia since 2021, which of course brings into question to what degree was it committed to ending the genocide in Palestine? That's number one. But also, as I said, back to Qatar, because Russia now is clearly kind of apparently climbing into bed with Qatar and with Saudi Arabia, that is on the verge of normalizing with the Zionist entity. And of course, that was one of the reasons that Trump engineered the ceasefire as one of the first things that he did when he came to office. And you know, I'm very similar to you. I don't see this as anything spectacular. I just see it as kind of tag team foreign policy. You know, Biden did what he was supposed to do during his administration, and Trump steps in to continue the job. That's how it is. That's what he did in 2016 when he first came in, very successfully, and actually very, very similar in that he threw the non-aligned axis into confusion because they all started thinking they could do deals with Trump, whereas had Hillary Clinton been elected, they all hated her, so there would have been cohesion, right? It was very obvious to me at the time that they couldn't allow Clinton to be elected because then the non-aligned axis would have been much stronger after 4 years of Clinton's war hawkery, you know? Sorry, go on.
I just want to say that's an important point to make because a lot of people see Trump as even outside of the United States. A lot of people here in Russia that are politically involved in some way or another see Trump as the better option, as the person that they can at least work with, that is going to somehow make the United States plausible, and that is the overwhelming sentiment that is coming from here. And I think that again goes back to the misunderstanding they still have of American politics and American intentions, and almost the naivety of thinking that they can trust in this system, that, you know, a president can actually dictate something that is going to happen, instead of understanding it fully, that when we say military industrial complex, you know, intelligence apparatus, we mean that. Like when we talk about who is running the show, it wasn't Joe Biden. Joe Biden couldn't run his day. It was certainly not. And it's not Trump. I mean, Trump, you know, came in as a position of draining the swamp, as somebody in 2016. Who he is now is completely different. The same as Robert F. Kennedy, who came in as a, you know, we're gonna question the vaccine. Now he's saying Operation Warp Speed, which was the operation to vaccinate Americans, was an amazing accomplishment by Donald Trump. So what you're seeing here is this mistaken this mistaken thought from a lot of people who still think the United States has some, like, the government has some redeeming qualities. Obviously, the people, to an extent, yes, not everybody is awful, but I'm talking about the government. The government itself is, I think, they think has an ability to be rescued or changed or reformed, and it's just not the case when there is the power hold is not a democratic power hold, or a republic of sorts. It's none of these things. There is no way to control it. The people are not being served in the United States. So it's kind of, I think it's frustrating for me as an American, actually, to be surrounded by people who give it more credit than I do, when I'm like telling you they're not going to negotiate with you in the right way. They don't have your best interests. They don't have anyone's best interest, not even my interest. It's the interest of you know, of this elite
Millionaire
cabal
class,
group. Yeah.
exactly. And it's that sort of great analysis by Eric USA where he was basically
Yeah.
saying Trump, but I think it, you know, it applies to, as you said, the predator class in the United States across the board, that it's always negotiation is always win-lose. It's
Yeah.
not win-win. And this is the problem. I think I don't know if it's naivety. I don't know if it's just such a strong ideological trait in many of the non-aligned axis countries where they feel that they are focused on a win-win solution. And so they kind of project that onto the United States, which again comes back to the point you made, that they don't really understand the enemy at the end of the day. You know, and until that changes, until they actually understand that they're in a, from the US point of view, they're in a win-lose negotiation paradigm,
Yeah.
and understand that you can only come to countries like, or rather non-countries like Israel and countries like the US, with any structured plan for negotiation, you have to be in a position of power. And I don't really see that at the moment with the way things are panning out. And as you said, Turkey now is very much at the helm. You know, you can see it from the reactions when you watch the foreign minister in an interview. He's smug. They're smug right now. And it's coming across to me very clearly in body language, in statements, that they definitely feel that they have the upper hand on both Russia and Iran right now, right? And you know, we can never forget Turkey's a NATO member state. That's not going to go away. And so, yeah, I'd just like to get any last thoughts from you. Particularly, I guess, I just want to come back to this sort of appalling idea that Assad might be extradited to Syria, because this for me was, you know, even we talked about it and I said, well, God, maybe, I don't know, it's interpretation by the Syrian news agency that now, of course, is completely under the control of Al Qaeda, and it's putting out the statements that correlate with Al Qaeda policy in Syria. Because it doesn't only mention President Assad, it mentions his close associates, right? So even the fact that this idea is being floated is dangerous to me. And I'm just wondering if you think Russia in any way, shape or form would ever be put into a position where it complied with such a demand.
Well, the reports are that it would be in response to, if they agree to this, then they would keep their base. But I don't see, I have a hard time believing that they would, because it would discredit them so much in the eyes of not just the non-aligned axis, but of the public that has put too much of rose-colored glasses on Russia as an ideological nation, which it isn't. It is, as I said, it's a pragmatic government, at least in government form. And the problem with that is because when there is this lack of ideology, there are attempts to please everybody, to try to work with everybody and try to find a solution, but that has its limits when you're presenting a false sense of peace. And we have to be very, very careful with a false sense of peace, because that's how your enemy gets you. And again, and when we talk about, you know, if the fact that this was even put out there, I do find that insulting, because it's kind of like, how would you even listen to that? You know, the spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, didn't answer the question of the press when he was asked this. He hasn't commented on it. So it wasn't, I do believe that what that was said, that it was asked of them to do this because of the fact he didn't answer. If he always answers, if this was a lie, for example, like when Tucker Carlson said that the Biden administration tried to kill Putin, you know, he's like, they're like, no, that didn't happen. You might not want to listen to everything you hear, blah, blah, blah. But with this, there wasn't a denial. There was just a no comment. So that gives me the sense that they were asked but there hasn't been a comment on it. And that also
Yeah.
makes me more apprehensive, because I do think that if that's the case, it would honestly discredit so much of what Russia has done. And honestly, even this meeting happening
Yeah.
so quickly, for many, it is going to discredit all the work that they've done in Syria with the Syrian Arab Army against these very terrorist factions that they have. So, I mean, Russia has at every turn talked about defeating these terrorist factions, these, jihadist, Wahhabist factions, and they themselves have had this problem due to terrorist attacks in Russia, in the Russian Federation. These same factions have worked with Ukrainian terrorists to attack Russians themselves over this whole war. So for them, this is personal. So I'm a little bit like kind of been trying to think what exactly is going on, because this is,
Yeah.
and Putin's comment, if you remember, Vanessa, where he made that comment about, well, these are no longer terrorists because the United
Yeah.
States doesn't.
Yeah.
I'm
Everyone
kind of thinking,
assumed
like,
it was irony.
yeah, but it wasn't, like,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I have a hard Putin is extremely intelligent, and but that doesn't mean he's beyond reproach. But I just don't. I had a hard time seeing him say that not in jest, and I think a lot of people did too, because he knows these are terrorists. Like, he's not dumb. He knows these people are terrorists. So for me, it was like, why would you say they're not terrorists? I just don't buy that I think there was something more there, because there obviously are. I mean, the United States had a bounty on them, and he even mentioned that. So for me, I have been trying to figure out what their thinking is. And what I've come up with is that they simply want to maintain a relationship in Syria, their strategic interests in their bases, and they want to still have a hold there because they know that Turkey is taking over basically everything,
Yeah.
and that they need to if maintain something there. And I also think that Iran is a part of this in the terms of having that access as well. But I have a hard time thinking that they would give in somebody like Bashar al-Assad. Humanitarian asylum has its limits, right? You were the one that pointed that out, I think. But it honestly would be just detrimental to everything they stand for, as at the very least an opposing nation to the collective West, a nation that's talking about sovereignty and literally fought with Syria. That would be a betrayal, I think, because it would basically humiliate them, because they stood with Assad. They fought with Assad.
Yeah.
So I just don't see that happening, at least not overtly in the
Yeah.
way
I mean,
we've seen it.
it could be, it could be hubris simply from HTS, because they were also talking about, reparations for the damage to Syria, which is kind of, again, like you said, it's just complete inversion of reality, because what actually happened was Russia and Syria and Hezbollah and Iran and various allies were fighting the terrorism presented or represented by HTS.
Yeah.
So it's, yeah, I mean, we are living in a very kind of inverted world right now, particularly regards Syria. So I guess, like you, I kind of hope there is some kind of higher strategy going on with regards to Russia's reactions. But it's been very helpful for me, especially, to kind of sit down with you today and just try and untangle it all. And for people to understand, that's what this is about. It's not about drawing conclusions or condemning Russia or condemning what is actually going on, although I do condemn normalizing relations with the Zionist entity or with terrorist organizations, whoever they are, right? Mm-hmm. Whether it's Nazis, whether it's Zionists, whether it's Wahhabis or Muslim Brotherhood, terrorist factions, I do condemn that on any level by anyone, right? Just to be clear. But yeah, I think, we're just going to have to wait and see what transpires over the next few days, weeks, months, and things seem to be gathering momentum to an incredible extent, and also to see where Trump's heading with everything. I
Well,
mean, we
yeah.
have a pretty good idea, but you know,
Yeah, it's what the Palestinian condoms comment wasn't enough.
uh,
Like I mean,
yeah,
this administration is the most Zionist administration to
yeah,
ever step in, flat out. I mean, they really are, and he is talking about deporting people who talk negatively about
yeah,
Israel. So
as
I mean,
anti-Semitism.
and the free speech warriors that have
Yeah,
supported Donald
exactly.
Trump. I mean, what are you supporting? That's not free speech. If even if you disagree, it's not free speech actually. And in regarding just one last thing about Russia and the Gulf states and stuff, they've had a relationship with Israel and the
Yeah.
Gulf states for a while. So it's not surprising to me that that relationship is there. And one of the things that we know was, there was an angry sentiment towards Assad for not wanting to speak with Erdogan
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
Assad was not as diplomatic and in a time when many say he should have been. So, I think that's also part of it. Is the differences between an ideological type of leader and the ones that are looking at both things. They may be ideological, they may not be, but when sometimes the ideology can be your worst enemy or your best friend, right? So it's for Assad, I think for it seems there was some sort of ideological emotional maneuver, not maneuver, but stance that was
Yeah.
strong against Turkey. And I understand it because obviously, Erdogan's ambitions, anybody could see from a mile away. But it's not surprising to me because of Russia's relationship with Israel. It's still there. It's still strong. They don't really go after Israel in the way that they should. They here and then you'll see some of the people in government say things about what Israel has done, but that relationship is still
Yeah.
strong, effectively. And in a just world, there wouldn't be a relationship with Israel, not just by Russia, but by China,
Anyone.
by everybody else, and same with some of these Gulf states. There wouldn't be a relationship with
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia, but there's also the oil. There's also all of these transactions that take place, and we live in a transactional world. So, that's unfortunately part of it, and why I think so many want to try things out with Donald Trump to see what he says. He's coming in with this American bravado, and for some reason that is attractive to people in the non-aligned access.
Yeah.
They tend to promote and put out these figures with that sort of macho characteristic that has been so definitive but detrimental to the U.S. System, to the U.S. as a country. It is that very bravado and macho bully attitude that has gotten us to where we are today in the world and also in the U.S. It's that very same narcissistic type of attitude. So if we are going to be honest, I think it is on also, as you mentioned earlier, the non-aligned access to really realize that these people will not accept them ever. Not this government, not this United States, the way it is now, will not accept them. They are a danger to their own people. They're a danger to the world, and they are only going to look out for what as was mentioned earlier, what they want, what they need, and not care about anybody else. And that's just the reality of it. They need to go into this any sort of decision making.
Yeah.
They need to know that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Fee, thank you so much. I know it sort of, I'm not sure it clarified a ton of things, because I know that we think quite similarly anyway, but it was really helpful just to talk through it all. And I hope people listening also find it helpful. Where can people follow you? I know that you've been doing a lot of work at your Substack, which is fantastic. So I do recommend people follow you there, but where else can they find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter X at Fiorella Isabel M. I'm also on Telegram at Fiorella in Moscow, and I have YouTube under Truthwire, and my own Rumble at Fiorella Isabel. So you can check all of that out. And thank you, Vanessa, for having me. I feel like we just kind of rambled today, but I did at least. I feel like I was rambling, but it was helpful
Yeah.
for me as well.
All right. Take care, Fee, and speak to you very soon.